The snow had stopped falling for exactly 1 hour when the men from town finally came to look for the bodies. They did not expect to find a door. 3 days earlier, the sky over that stretch of prairie had turned the color of a bruise, and every rancher within 20 miles had told his wife the same thing. Get the animals in, get the water in, pray the roof holds. Nobody had said that about the family living in the hole in the ground. That was what they called it that autumn, when the digging first began. A hole, not a home. Neighbors had ridden past on their way to town and slowed their horses just long enough to shake their heads at the sight of a grown man standing waist-deep in his own land, cutting into the earth as if he meant to bury something. Some said he was hiding from a debt. Some said the last piece of ground he had worked, 2 counties east, had broken him in a way no man fully recovers from, and that this was what was left of his judgment. Nobody asked him directly. On the prairie that year, a man's failures were his own business, right up until the moment they became everyone else's problem. By the time the frost came hard in November, the digging had stopped, and something else had taken its place. Walls that were not quite walls. A roof that was mostly grass. A chimney that leaned at an angle no carpenter would have approved of. The rancher who owned the land to the north rode past it twice that week, just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. He wasn't. What nobody in that county understood yet, what even the family living inside it were still learning by lamplight and by touch, and by the sound water makes when it finds a way in that it was never invited to use, was that the ground itself had been trying to keep people warm for longer than any of them had been alive. The blizzard that arrived in January was not an ordinary storm. Men twice the age of anyone reading a weather sign that winter would later call it the worst in 25 years, and not one of them would exaggerate to make the point. It found every gap, every proud roof, every chimney built with confidence instead of patience. And when it was finished, it found one house that should not have still been standing, with smoke still rising, thin and steady, from a chimney that leaned at an angle no carpenter would have approved of. This is the story of how it got there, and what it cost the man who built it to trust something the rest of his neighbors had already decided was beneath them. Elias Marsh had seen bad land before, but he had never seen land this honest about it. There were no trees to speak of, no stone worth quarrying, just grass, flat and endless, rolling out toward a horizon that never seemed to arrive no matter how long the wagon rolled toward it. His wife, Ruth, sat beside him with their daughter Sarah asleep against her shoulder, and their younger boy, Noah, kept standing up in the back of the wagon to look at nothing in particular, the way children do when the nothing is new to them. 2 counties east, there had been a farm. There had been a barn, half-built, and a well that never quite reached water, and a landlord who had smiled at them right up until the morning he told them the note was due in full. Elias did not like to think about that morning. He thought about it anyway, most nights, the way a man returns to a wound just to be sure it is still there. This new parcel had cost him almost nothing, which should have told him something. The man at the land office had barely looked up from his ledger when he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the last family to try this stretch had left before their first winter was through. Elias had not asked why. He had a wagon with what remained of their belongings, a small amount of coin that would not survive being spent carelessly, and roughly 2 months before the first hard frost typically arrived this far north. 2 months to build something that would keep his family alive through a season he had never spent in this particular kind of emptiness. A proper cabin needed lumber. Lumber needed trees, or money to haul planks in from a mill 3 days away, money he did not have, and time he had even less of. He stood at the edge of the wagon that first evening, looking at the ground beneath his boots, and for a long moment he did not see grass at all. he saw a slope. Not much of one. Just enough of a rise in the land, running north to south, that the wind coming down from the plains might, if a man positioned himself correctly, pass over rather than through. Ruth came and stood beside him without a word. She had learned, over the 2 counties in the 4 years since their wedding, when her husband needed a question and when he needed silence. This was silence. She looked at the same slope he was looking at and said only one thing. "There's no wood here to build with, Elias." "No," he said. "There isn't." He did not tell her what he was thinking. Not yet. It was still half a memory, something his own father used to describe from a life before either of them had ever set foot in this country, and it felt too strange, too far from anything the neighbors 3 miles off would call a proper house, to say out loud on the first night. But he kept looking at that slope until the light went out of the sky entirely, and something in the way he stood there, feet planted, arms crossed, told Ruth that her husband had already made a decision. She simply did not know yet what it was. It came to him fully the next morning, while he was kneeling in the grass with a handful of the soil pressed between his fingers. His father had never called it anything grand. He had simply called it the old way, the way his own people had built along certain rivers in the east, in a country of open steppe, not so different from the one Elias now knelt in. Elias had been perhaps 6 years old the last time his father described it, sitting by a stove in a house made of proper timber, telling stories the way tired men tell stories, half for the child and half for himself. They did not build up out of the ground there, his father had said. Not when the wind came without anything to slow it and the trees were too far away to be worth the wait. They built down into it and let the earth itself do the work no lumber could do as well. Thick walls the wind could not find its way through. A roof low enough that the worst of any storm passed over it rather than into it. Elias had not thought about that stove-side story in 20 years. He was not entirely sure, kneeling there with dirt on his fingers, that he was remembering it correctly, or whether some of what he now recalled was invention, filling gaps his 6-year-old memory had never properly held in the first place. It did not matter. It was the only plan he had. He found Ruth at the wagon, sorting what little they had left into piles that made the scarcity harder to ignore rather than easier. He told her plainly. They would not build a cabin, not the kind their neighbors would recognize. They would dig into the rise of that slope, timber the opening as best they could with what little wood the wagon and the nearest creek bed could provide, and let the walls themselves be earth, packed and cut into blocks the way his father had once described sod being cut on land, not so different from this. Ruth did not answer immediately. She looked toward the slope, then back at her husband, then at the 2 children now watching from a short distance, sensing without understanding that something important was being decided. "People will say we're living like animals," she said finally. Not as an accusation. As a fact, she wanted spoken aloud before it could be spoken by someone crueler. "Let them say it in a warm house," Elias answered, "and I'll listen." It was not a confident thing to say. He did not feel confident saying it, but he had done the arithmetic of their situation more times than he wanted to admit, and every version of it ended the same way. There was no time to haul in enough lumber. There was no money to pay for it, if there had been. There was only the ground, the 2 months, and a story his father had told him 20 years ago, beside a stove that no longer existed. He picked up the one good shovel they owned and walked toward the slope before he could talk himself out of it. The first man to see the hole was Silas Boyd, who ran cattle on the section just north of Elias's new claim and had, by his own account, buried 2 brothers and 1 wife on this stretch of prairie, which he felt gave him standing to speak plainly about what the ground could and could not be trusted to do, He rode up on the third day of digging, sat his horse at the edge of what was, by then, a trench roughly 4 feet deep and considerably wider than any grave had a right to be, and simply watched for a while before he spoke. "That's a grave, Marsh," he said, "not a house." Elias kept working. "It's neither yet." "You know what happens to a hole like that come spring thaw," Silas went on. And it was clear from his tone that this was not idle mockery. He had seen dugouts before, on land further west, and he had seen what became of the families who tried them without understanding the ground beneath their own feet. Water finds low places. It always has. You dig yourself a low place and call it a home. The water's going to move in whether you've invited it or not. And that's before we speak of what else finds a low, dark place appealing come the warmer months. Snakes don't ask permission either. It was not an unreasonable warning. Elias knew that much even as he wished it away. Silas Boyd was not a cruel man, and he was not entirely wrong. Water did find low places. Snakes did seek shelter in the cool dark. The prairie was full of examples, if a man wanted to go looking for them, of exactly this kind of ambition ending in exactly the kind of ruin Silas was describing. "I've thought about the water," Elias said, which was true, though he had not yet solved it. "Thinking about it and answering it aren't the same trade," Silas said, not unkindly, and turned his horse back toward his own land, where a proper timber house stood with proper timber walls, built the way houses in that county were supposed to be built. Elias stood in the trench a while longer after Silas had gone, the shovel resting against his leg, and allowed himself for just a moment the doubt he had been keeping at arm's length since the first morning. Silas was not a fool. Silas had buried people on this land and knew things about it that no land office ledger would ever record. But behind him, back at the wagon, Noah was coughing, a small dry cough that had started 2 days earlier and had not yet gone away. And Ruth was watching her husband from the wagon seat with an expression that was not quite worry and not quite faith, but something suspended between the two, waiting to see which one the coming weeks would prove correct. Elias picked the shovel back up. They worked from first light until the light was no longer worth the effort of pretending to see by. The trench became a room, and the room became something with corners, and the corners became something that might, with enough patient repetition, deserve to be called walls. Elias cut blocks of the thick prairie sod the way he remembered his father describing, roughly 2 feet long, and a hand's width thick, root-bound grass turned upward, like a roof shingle turned sideways, and stacked them the way a man stacks anything he is not yet sure will hold. Carefully, then more carefully. What little proper timber they could gather, mostly from a creek bed roughly 3 miles east that had never grown much beyond scrub, went to the doorway, and the small section of roof directly above where the stove would eventually sit. The rest of the roof was a lattice of thinner branches, packed over with another layer of sod, root side down, the grass itself left to keep growing into a green ceiling that Elias hoped, without being entirely certain, might hold the whole roof together the way a woven basket holds its shape. Ruth worked beside him for most of it, packing clay and mud into the gaps between the sod blocks with her bare hands, a task that left her knuckles raw and cracked by the second week. Sarah, at 9 years old, was given the job of hauling water from the nearest spring, a task she treated with the seriousness of someone twice her age, and Noah, when his cough allowed it, gathered kindling and stacked stones near where the small stove would go, more to feel useful than because the stones were yet needed. There was a day, near the middle of the second week, when a hard rain came through and they had nowhere to shelter it but under the half-built roof itself, and Elias spent an hour with his hand pressed flat against the ceiling, feeling for the give that would mean the whole thing was about to come down on his family's heads. It held. Barely, and only because he had built it slower and thicker than he'd first planned. But it held. By the end of the second month, what stood on that slope was not a cabin in any sense the neighbors 3 miles off would recognize. It was low and thick-walled, and mostly hidden by the very ground it had been carved into, with a single small window facing south, and a chimney, cobbled together from creek stone and clay, rising at an angle that betrayed exactly how much of this Elias Marsh was improvising as he went. The first hard frost arrived 4 days after they moved the last of their belongings inside. They had made it in time. What none of them yet knew was whether making it in time had been the difficult part, or only the beginning of it. For 11 days, the house held. It held through the first hard frost, through 2 mornings of wind strong enough to flatten the grass flat against the earth for a mile in every direction, and through the particular kind of cold that made Ruth keep touching the walls almost without meaning to, the way a person checks a sleeping child's breathing. The walls were cool, but dry. The stove, small and second-hand, kept the single room warm enough that Noah's cough had quieted to almost nothing. Elias allowed himself, on the 12th night, something close to relief. The storm that came on the 13th night was not the blizzard. It was only rain, a long and heavy autumn rain that fell for nearly a full day without pause. The kind of rain that farmers 3 miles off would have called ordinary, even useful, if it had fallen on ordinary ground. It did not fall on ordinary ground. It fell on a roof made of branches and packed sod, on walls cut into the side of a slope, on a house built by a man working from a 20-year-old memory, and very little else. Ruth noticed it first, the way she noticed most things first in that house, a habit born of spending more waking hours inside it than her husband did, a darkening patch near the northeast corner of the ceiling, where the roof met the earthen wall at an angle Elias had not been entirely satisfied with, even while building it. By midday, the patch had become a trickle. By evening, it was no longer a trickle at all. "Elias?" Her voice was steady, but it carried the particular flatness of someone choosing not to sound as frightened as she felt. He was already moving toward the corner before she finished his name. Water was running down the inside of the wall in a thin, steady line, darkening the packed earth, pooling faintly at the base where the wall met the dirt floor. Not a flood. Not yet. But a wrongness, undeniable and getting worse by the hour, in a house that had no second room to retreat to, and no cellar beneath it to catch what the walls could not hold back. Sarah moved their bedding away from the corner without being asked. Noah, sensing the tension more than understanding its cause, pressed himself against his mother's side and watched his father with the particular attentiveness that children bring to moments adults are trying and failing to keep calm. Elias pressed his palm flat against the wet earth, feeling for how deep the moisture had traveled, and found, to his quiet dread, that it had already gone further than the surface. The wall was not simply wet. It was beginning, in that one corner, to soften. He thought of Silas Boyd, sitting his horse at the edge of the trench weeks earlier, speaking with the plain authority of a man who had buried people on this land. Water finds low places. It always has. He had thought he understood that warning. Kneeling in the dark, with his hand against a softening wall, while his family watched him, he understood that he had not understood it at all. Not yet. He did not sleep that night, and he did not spend the hours he was awake doing what panic would have suggested, which was patching the corner with whatever mud and grass he could gather in the dark, and hoping the patch held. Instead, once the rain finally slowed toward dawn, he went outside. He walked the length of the roofline in the gray, early light, boots sinking slightly into ground, still soft from the storm. And he did something he realized, somewhat uncomfortably. he should have done before he ever cut the first block of sod. He followed the water. Not the water inside the house, the water outside it, the water still moving across the surface of the slope, finding its own paths downward the way water always does, indifferent to whatever a man has built in its way. He traced one thin, silvery line of runoff from a point higher on the slope, watched it curve, watched it gather speed where the ground dipped slightly, and watched it arrive, with a kind of patient inevitability, directly at the northeast corner of his own roof. He had built the house facing south, toward the sun, exactly as his father's old description had suggested. What he had not accounted for, what no story told by a stove 20 years ago could have told him, was the particular shape of this particular slope, the way it gathered water from higher ground and funneled it, almost deliberately, toward the one corner where his roof line met the earth at its lowest point. The wall had not failed because sod was a poor material. The wall had failed because he had built it in the water's path and asked it to argue with something water had been doing to that hillside for longer than any house had stood on it. Ruth found him still out there an hour later, crouched at the corner, tracing the line of the runoff with his finger in the mud like a man reading a message written specifically for him. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. "Not can we leave." Not I told you this was foolish. Just the practical question, asked by a woman who had already decided, somewhere in the last 11 days, that this house was worth saving if saving it was possible. Elias did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the shape of the roof line, about a shallow channel cut into the earth just above and behind the house, angled to catch that same runoff and carry it around the structure instead of into it, the way a man might dig a ditch not to bring water somewhere, but to decide, deliberately, where it was and was not permitted to go. "I think so," he said finally. "I built it as though the ground didn't have opinions of its own. I don't think I can make that mistake twice." The channel took 4 days to dig, working alone at first, then with Silas Boyd's grudging help on the 3rd day, after the rancher rode past, saw what Elias was doing, and dismounted without a word to pick up a second shovel. Neither man spoke much while they worked. Silas had not changed his opinion of the house, exactly, but there was a difference, and both men seemed to sense it, between a man ignoring a problem and a man correcting one, and Silas Boyd had never been the kind of neighbor who withheld help from the second sort, whatever he thought of the first. "You'll want it deeper on that side," was the only real guidance he offered, pointing toward the section of the ditch nearest the softened corner, "where the ground's already shown you it likes to travel." Elias dug it deeper on that side. By the time the first real snow arrived, roughly 3 weeks later, a light fall that dusted the prairie without truly testing it, the channel was finished. The softened corner had been repacked with fresh clay and a heavier layer of sod, and Elias found himself standing outside his own house at dawn after that first snowfall, with a feeling he did not entirely trust, because it resembled something close to confidence. The roof held its dusting of snow evenly, without the telltale dark patches of melting that would have signaled heat escaping unevenly through a weak section. The chimney drew smoke in a thin, steady column that rose almost straight up before the wind caught it, rather than curling back down toward the roof the way smoke does when a flue is fighting itself. Inside, the single room held a warmth that did not need constant feeding to maintain, a warmth that seemed in some way Elias did not yet have the words to fully explain, to be coming from the walls themselves as much as from the stove. It was not proof of anything, not yet. A light snow was not the same trial as the storms this stretch of prairie was capable of producing, and Elias knew better than to mistake one for the other. But for the first time since the rain had found its way through his northeast corner, he allowed himself to imagine that the house might do what he had built it to do. Noah's cough, which had never fully disappeared, seemed a little quieter that week. Ruth noticed it too, though neither of them said so directly, as if naming the improvement out loud might undo it. They had passed the first test. Somewhere beyond the horizon, though none of them yet knew to look for it, a much larger one was already beginning to take shape. The talk started in town in early January, the way this kind of talk always seemed to start, in half-sentences exchanged at the feed store and the church steps, in the particular tone people use when they are more certain of something than they want to admit out loud. The old-timers were the ones who said it plainest. A cattleman named Increase Whitfield, who claimed to remember the winter of 1856 well enough to still feel it in his knees, stood outside the general store and told anyone who would listen that the birds had gone quiet 3 days early this year, that the cattle had bunched together tighter than he'd seen in a decade, and that a man who had survived enough prairie winters developed a feeling for the ones that meant to be remembered. Silas Boyd brought the news out to the Marsh homestead himself, riding out on a gray, still afternoon that felt, to Elias, uncomfortably like the held breath before a held breath. "They're saying it's shaping up to be the worst in 25 years, Silas said, without any of the satisfaction a less generous neighbor might have taken in delivering a warning to a man who had ignored his first one. "Might be old men talking. Might not be. I've learned not to bet against Increase Whitfield's knees." Elias thanked him and said nothing else, because there was, in that moment, very little else to say that would have changed anything. They had wood stacked, though not as much as he would have liked. They had the channel dug, and the corner repaired, and a chimney that drew clean, steady smoke. They had done what could be done with the time and materials available to them. What they did not have, what no amount of careful sod cutting or clay packing could provide, was certainty. And 2 nights after Silas's visit, as if the prairie itself had been listening for the right moment to make its point, Noah's cough returned, worse than before, a dry, rattling sound that kept Ruth awake long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, her hand resting against her son's chest, counting each breath the way a person counts something they are afraid to stop counting. Elias lay awake beside her, listening to his son's breathing, and to the wind outside, which had, sometime in the last hour, begun to shift, moving in from a direction it had not come from all winter. He did not know yet what that shift in wind would mean for the northeast corner of his roof, the one corner of the house that had already shown him, once, exactly what it was capable of doing when the weather turned against it. He would know soon enough. The blizzard did not arrive quietly. It came in from the northwest just after midnight, a wall of wind and snow that Elias would later struggle to describe to anyone who had not stood inside it, because no ordinary word for a storm seemed to account for the way it made the whole house shudder. A low, steady groan running through the packed earth walls like something enormous shifting its weight against them. For the first 2 hours, the house did what it had done all winter. The stove held its heat. The walls held their warmth. The chimney drew its thin column of smoke upward before the wind tore it sideways into the dark. Then, sometime near 2 in the morning, the wind shifted. It was Ruth who felt it first, the way she had felt the rain first, months earlier, a change in the sound the storm was making against the northeast corner, the same corner that had once let rain trickle down the inside wall, the same corner Elias had repacked with fresh clay and reinforced sod after tracing the water's path in the mud at dawn. The wind, coming now from a new angle it had not held all season, had found the one seam in the roofline that even Elias's corrections had not fully anticipated, a narrow gap where the repaired section met the older sod, weathered and slightly shrunk by months of frost and thaw. It was not water this time. It was the wind itself, forcing its way through the gap in short, hard gusts, and with it came a fine, needling spray of snow that began, almost imperceptibly at first, to settle inside the northeast corner of the room. Noah's cough, already worse from the fever that had crept in over the previous 2 days, seemed to catch every time that cold draft reached him, and Ruth moved his bedding away from the corner for the second time in his short life, her hands not quite steady as she did it. Elias. Her voice, when she said his name this time, held none of the practiced calm she had managed during the rain. The winds found something. He was already awake, already listening to the sound the storm was making, and he understood, in the space of a few seconds, that he had a decision to make with no good option fully visible to him. He could try to seal the gap from the inside, in the dark, in the cold, with materials that would take time he was not sure they had. He could move the stove and the family's bedding to the opposite side of the small room, accepting the draft rather than fighting it, and hope the cold air did not spread far enough to undo what warmth remained. Or he could do both, working fast, trusting that the channel he had dug months earlier, the one meant to carry water safely around the house, would do something for wind-blown snow that it had never been built to manage. He chose to do all three, because a night like that one did not leave room for choosing only the safest option. He worked by feel more than sight, packing wet cloth and the last of the spare clay into the gap, while Ruth moved Noah and Sarah to the warmest corner of the room, nearest the stove, and built the fire higher than she had allowed herself to all winter, watching the wood supply with an expression that said she understood exactly what she was spending and why. It took the better part of an hour before the draft slowed to something manageable, then stopped entirely. The wind outside did not stop. It went on through the night and into the following day, the worst of it lasting nearly 18 hours before it finally began to ease. But inside the house, the gap held. Noah's fever broke sometime before dawn, not because of anything dramatic, but because the room stayed warm enough, steadily enough, for his small body to do what fevers eventually do when given the chance. Ruth did not sleep that night. She sat beside him with her hand on his chest, counting breaths until the gray light finally came through the small south-facing window, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 18 hours, to close her eyes. When Elias finally stepped outside, 2 full days after the storm had begun, the prairie he walked into was almost unrecognizable. Drifts taller than a grown man had reshaped the land in every direction. Fence posts on Silas Boyd's section had vanished entirely beneath the snow. Somewhere to the east, he would later learn, 3 homesteads had lost roofs entirely, and one family had spent the worst of the storm huddled in a root cellar meant to hold potatoes, not people. His own roof still stood. Thin smoke still rose from the chimney at its familiar crooked angle, and the walls, when he pressed his palm against them from the outside, were cold to the touch but solid, unmoved by 2 days of the worst wind that stretch of prairie had seen in a quarter century. Silas Boyd rode out 3 days later, once the roads were passable enough to allow it, and said very little when he saw the house still standing, smoke still rising, a family still inside it. He did not mention the grave comment from months earlier. He did not need to. He simply stood in the doorway a moment, hat in his hands, looking at the low earthen walls the way a man looks at something he has been forced to reconsider. By the following autumn, 2 other families in the county had begun cutting into their own hillsides, following Elias's example more than his father's old description, since it was Elias's house, not some half-remembered story from the steppe, that the neighbors had actually seen survive. The house was never beautiful. It never stopped leaning slightly at that one crooked chimney, and it never fully lost the reputation, among strangers passing through, of looking more like a mound in the earth than a home. But Elias Marsh had not built it to be admired. He had built it to give a hard winter fewer places to reach his family, and on the one night that mattered most, it had done exactly that, and nothing more was required of it than that. The wall was not beautiful. It was patient. And that winter, patience had been enough. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes, reconstructed from general frontier building practices of the era. Specific names, dialogue, and events are dramatized. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.